Hey, thank you, Libby, and thanks everybody for coming. This is a real treat for me as a relatively new member of the congregation, the community. I know maybe a couple of years old. I know about half of you on the screen here, and I look forward to meeting and getting to know others better too. And so this is a great opportunity for me, and it's sort of appropriate that the theme this month is telling your story, and here I am telling my story, and here I am just having about a month or 2 months ago published a book, a memoir, in which I tell my story. Let's see, I'm holding up on the screen, but the words look backwards to me. I don't know if they look backwards to you. It says Coming of Age in the Baby Boom, a memoir of personal development, social action, education reform, and Adirondack preservation. And I thought I'd begin my presentation, if you will, by just reading what's on the back cover of the book. And then I'd talk for about 15 minutes about my personal history, and then do a reading from the book about a topic that could be of mutual interest. It's in the area of spirituality, you might say. And so that would take about a half an hour altogether. And so to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of my life, this is the story of a white, middle-class, privileged youth embodying the contradictions of growing up in post-war America. As a boy, he won 2 citizenship medals from the American Legion. As a youth, he was chased by legionnaires down the main street of his hometown for organizing against the Vietnam War. Growing up, he had little or no contact with minorities, but he became deeply involved in the civil rights movement, including participation in the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer. He was an Eagle Scout and an assistant scoutmaster who experimented with a variety of illicit drugs. He moved to the Adirondack Mountains to live like Thoreau in a cabin in the woods without phone or electricity, and ended up owning or managing several grand rustic estates of Alfred Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and other icons of the Gilded Age. He was raised in Judaism, became an agnostic, had a mystical experience, and forged his own spiritual integration. He loved his strong, moralistic father, then hated him. Then in archetypal fashion, both gradually learned to love and accept one another. His early relationships with girls and women were desperate, selfish, and patriarchal. Then he became a thoughtful and egalitarian partner and lover. His self-concept was that of an anti-establishment outsider, yet he initiated and co-led a successful effort to amend New York State's Constitution. Along the way toward reconciling such contradictions, he wrote some 25 books, became a leader in education, counseling, and historic preservation, debated moral majority leader Reverend Jerry Falwell before an audience of 2,000 people, was interviewed by Phil Donahue on the Today Show, ran the New York City Marathon, hiked the 46 peaks of the Adirondacks, and raised a family. So that's kind of a little snapshot of many elements of my life. But I guess I'd begin in terms of reflecting on how that all began in describing my parents a little bit and my grandparents. My maternal grandparents were German Jews who came to the United States in the 1840s. One of them even went out to the gold rush in California, was unsuccessful. My paternal grandparents were Eastern European Jews who came over in steerage in the 1890s, and they moved to the New York City area, where my maternal grandparents moved out to the new city of Long Beach. It had just been developed in the 1920s, about 30 miles from New York City, on the southern shore of Long Island, about 25, 30 miles from New York City. And that's where I grew up, in the city of Long Beach, a little community of about 20,000 people, surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Reynolds Channel, the bay on the other side, a little sandbar about a mile wide and 15 miles long. And in the 2-square-mile center of that town, I grew up. And if you walk down to the boardwalk on the Atlantic side, there was a big sign that said America's Healthiest City. And that's how they build itself. And for me, it was a great, healthy, safe, secure place to grow up. I think it also influenced a later major part of my later life, in that growing up with the ocean just a few blocks on one side and the bay on the other, and on one end of town, the marshes of undeveloped Lido Beach, I was used to being surrounded by wilderness, in a sense. It was the jumping off point for the unknown. And so when I got involved in the Boy Scouts, going out to the woods to go camping was just something that felt so natural and right to me. So I don't think it's a surprise that I ended up with living half my year in the Adirondack Mountains, where we live half the year, and in Rochester half the year. It was my parents were decent, fair, liberal, politically liberal, just awfully steady, solid citizens, kind, thoughtful. Growing up, I had very little exposure to minorities, but the little exposure there was, my parents mediated. So when we had a Black man named Walter, who would come around every spring and do projects and painting for my family, he would sit at the table at lunch with us, and that was not remarkable. He was just, I remember just being fascinated by him, because he had this dark black skin and all these little white paint specks from the painting he had been doing around the house. And but it was no big deal. It was just somebody sitting there. My father was an attorney who, small time attorney, might say, real estate closings for people and wills and basic civil law. Practiced with a partner, and who, when we met them, again, it's no big deal. People were people as far as my parents were concerned. So they raised us to believe in the country's ideals. So I don't think it was a coincidence that when I went off to college at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, which in the 1960s, this was a border state, and they still had a great deal of segregation in Maryland. So it wasn't surprising to me that I would get involved in the civil rights movement and go on a freedom ride down Route 40, US 40, and try to integrate lunch establishments there. Group of white and black folks we would sit down at the lunch booths to try to be served, and generally were turned away. And later that night, on one of these occasions, we went to a roller skating rink to try to collectively, whites and blacks together, go roller skating. And we were denied admission. Well, the whites would have been allowed in, but our black brothers and sisters would not. And so we all picketed outside and with signs, and James Farmer, who is the national director of CORE, Congress for Racial Equality, one of the nation's civil rights leaders, he led the demonstration And when we all then, not all of us, but about 40 of us tried to move forward to enter the roller skating rink, we were arrested by the police and spent the night in jail. And so it was sort of a natural progression that I went on to get involved more deeply as a participant in the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964, where I had a really life-changing experience of spending 6 to 8 weeks in Mississippi working on voter registration, being arrested. Police tried to get the inmates to beat us up in jail, and we witnessed credible examples of heroism by the Black community, just willing to risk their homes, their jobs, even their lives to try to get the right to vote. It was 2 days before we were arrested in Mississippi. Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, 3 civil rights workers, disappeared, were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, and it was a major focus of the news that summer. And when I see what's happening today with the many forms of voter suppression going on around the country, just breaks my heart to think of how people, African Americans, have been working so tirelessly before 1964, after 1964. That was 56 years ago, and we're still going through some of the same painful struggles for equality and social justice. It's been one of the themes of my life, on and off, being more involved, less involved, and direct action, but always implicitly in my professional work, dealing with issues of human relations and justice. Another thing that I learned from my parents was how men and women were supposed to behave with one another. I mean, they were a great example of a loving, committed couple who were kind to one another, who committed to one another, supported one another in their own way. They were also a very traditional couple, and it took me many years and some failed relationships to, in a way, understand and outgrow some of the patriarchal patterns that I had grown up with. I remember, for example, when I first lived with a woman together, and we didn't explicitly discuss who would do what chores, but she had done the laundry one day and put my underwear in my drawer, just in a big clump. And I looked in there, and it wasn't right. The laundry is supposed to be folded. And I said, "How come you didn't fold my laundry?" And she said, "Why the hell should I fold your laundry? Fold your own laundry if you want it folded." And I was shocked by that thought, that I thought that just implicitly, not that I was conscious about it, but unconsciously, it seemed like, well, that's what women did. They folded men's laundry for them. And it took a good number of relationships where I eventually came to understand the patriarchy that permeated our society. And it just seemed like men's work was more important than women's work, was what I had unconsciously incorporated into my worldview. Men were the ones who had the interesting ideas that you'd want to be friends with. Might want to be with a woman for a romantic relationship, but for the things that really mattered in the world, men were the ones who were the movers and the shakers, and that's that's what I had to learn was a crippling set of assumptions, crippling for me personally, and for us all socially. And it was another thing that my parents taught was, I mean, the value of education. It was so important to them. Often is in Jewish households, not exclusively so, of course. But and when I came back from Mississippi and was searching for a vocation, it was to I realized that the education I had as a young person was just so divorced from what really mattered in the world that I wanted to become a teacher so I could get the young people that I taught involved in thinking about civil rights and human relations and peace and the other issues of the day. So in a sense, I became a teacher initially, an English and a history teacher, because I was angry about the education I had received, which seems so irrelevant. And I was fortunate to connect with some educators who were in the vanguard of thinking about different ways to humanize education. And I became involved in an approach of education called values clarification, in which the idea was to help young people get in touch with what they prized and cherished and look at alternatives, evaluate the consequences, make their own free choices, free if possible from authority and peer pressure, but more thoughtful, autonomous choices, and then to act on one's values and live them out in the world. This was what the kind of teacher I wanted to be. And I started to, with my colleagues Sid Simon and Merrill Harmon, started to teach and write about it. We wrote a book called Values Clarification, a handbook of practical strategies for teachers and students, that sold some 600,000 copies back in 1972. Really an educational blockbuster. And I was very involved in workshops and speaking around the country. And at that time, that was my first introduction to Unitarianism, because a lot of the Unitarian churches really ate up this values clarification. I mean, it was what they were about, wanting to help people think for themselves and search deeply inside for their own answers. And so I spoke at a good number of Unitarian churches, got to know many of the people. At that time, there was a group within the church that was developing the first sex education program for young people. And I was invited to participate in one of the workshops, sort of as a trial basis, where they were going to try it out and see how it worked, not with kids, but with adults first. And I came very close to becoming a Unitarian then. This is in the 70s. But I just couldn't do it. It's like my Jewishness held me back. I felt like I would be deserting. I would be betraying my heritage. All the people who died in the Holocaust, my own family background. It just seemed like intellectually it made sense for me. I was very compatible, but emotionally, culturally, I couldn't do it. And so I didn't. But I continued to have other experiences, thought for a good number of years about religious issues. And I'd like to do the reading now from my memoir that tells a little bit of part of the struggle for clarity about things spiritual and religious. And then I'll just finish up with a few more remarks after that. This is about 4.5 pages of, and it comes right after I was going through a couple of majors. To started out wanted to be a psychiatrist, so I was majoring as a pre-med, but I couldn't handle the biology and chemistry courses as a means toward an end, and I decided I'll go into psychology. Then I took my first psychology course, and it was all about rats and perception, and that's not what I wanted. I was interested in people, so I decided I'd become a philosophy major. But I was taking a course in existentialism and French literature, and reading Camus and Sartre. And here we go. Mike, I said one day, about the same time I was pledging Phi Epsilon Pi fraternity. This is Mike, my roommate. Mike, life has no meaning. He had just walked into our room as I looked up from my reading of Camus with tears in my eyes to make this announcement. He was not impressed. I was very upset. I had been an agnostic for several years. Ever since in high school, Corey and I had concluded that we saw no logical, compelling reason for the existence of God. Just because all the phonies believed in a God didn't mean we had to. On the other hand, it would be narrow-minded to be an atheist and declare there was no God, for there was no proof of that either. The world was a pretty incredible place. Some God or something might have created it. All that was pretty straightforward and intellectual and had little or no effect on my life. The question of meaning was quite another matter. The French existentialist forced me to examine the next step. So what? If there is no God, no ultimate judge of good and evil, no ultimate reward system, what then? We live for a while and we die? Is that it? I was one unhappy freshman and sophomore to think that that was all there was to it. It was not that I was troubled with the responsibility this philosophy entailed. I recognized that if it was up to each of us to create our own meaning in life, and that each choice and act on our part helped determine the future of the world, this was an enormous responsibility. That was all right. I was willing to live authentically, as the existentialist put it, accepting the moral responsibility for all my acts. In fact, I was actually flattered to be accorded such universal responsibility. And as I had believed for some time that I could handle it. The problem was that something was missing. It felt awfully to be the center of the universe, to have no ultimate grounding in the world other than one's own intellectual constructs, was a sad, solitary, and sometimes frightening prospect. I could handle it. I was tough, but unlike Sisyphus, I could not imagine myself happy with the situation. But that's what philosophy was all about, I figured, and I stuck with it. As I stared out at the horizon from my lifeguard stand, I thunk philosophical thoughts. I asked my regulars at the beach how they found meaning in their lives, and I argued theology and existentialism with them. I read and thought some more, and signed up for my first actual philosophy course for my sophomore fall at Hopkins. With the renowned Professor Mandelbaum. It seemed every one of my professors at Hopkins was purported to be one of the 4 leading authorities in their field. Mandelbaum may have been. He was a good lecturer, but again, I found the content dull. Pascal, Kant, Hobbes, Hegel, etc. An overview of the great philosophers. Here I was, bursting with excitement about ideas, ready like Bertrand Russell to explore the interface of philosophy and the pressing social issues of the day. Here I was, wanting to write my own great American philosophy, and instead we were required to memorize what this or that long-deceased philosopher thought about this or that arcane philosophical issue. Apparently, I concluded, that's what professional philosophers mostly did, split academic hairs. Another dead end. Religions of the East was much more exciting. Offered by the religion department and taught by Chester, a victim with braces and crutches, and an all-around fine human being, this course dealt directly with the philosophical questions I was grappling with. At least I sensed it did, because raised in a logical, positivist Western culture and by my lawyer father, it was difficult for me to grasp the elusive metaphysical construct, the perennial philosophy at the heart of most Eastern religions. I wrote it all down in my notebook, trying to understand. God, Brahma, the Tao, whatever one called it, was everything. A universal energy or life force pervaded everything. All animate and inanimate matter had that life force pulsing through it. Western scientists recognized that even the molecules of rocks were throbbing with atomic force fields. The energy-matter dichotomy was an illusion. There was no beginning and end to that life force. The energy that flowed all around the Earth's poles also flowed through my body. All was connected. That life force was God and flowed through each of us. I got it, and I didn't get it, but it was good stuff. Back at the fraternity house, I read Walpole's Ralhola's What the Buddha Taught. Among other things, he described a simple meditative breathing technique, which I tried. Relax, breathe deeply, concentrate on my breath. Let my concentration flow in and out of my body on each breath. Shift my consciousness to any part of my body that was tense or tight. As I breathe out, let the tension and tightness flow out of my body with my breath. It actually worked. All my life, I had had bad stomach cramps. The more I resisted the pain and wished it away, the more it hurt. Now I found that by relaxing, breathing deeply, freeing my mind of all thought, as my mind and breathing became one, I could transfer my awareness to my tight stomach and have the cramp gradually dissipate as the tension seemed to flow out of my body with my breath. I began to get an inkling of how energy did flow between me and the world outside. We read William James's essay on the 4 qualities of a mystical experience. A mystical experience was noetic. It had the quality of knowing. You knew that what you learned was true. It was holistic. The knowledge you gained was of everything and how it all fit together. It was ineffable. You couldn't really explain it to anyone. You had to be there. It was ineluctable. It just happened. You cannot call it forth or make it happen at will. I wrote it down, but it was, ineffable. I knew all about it, but I didn't know what the it was. Our religion class went to nearby Washington on a field trip to visit an ashram and a mosque. As we ate lunch, a wave of intense whispering spread from table to table. Within moments, everyone in the restaurant heard the news. President Kennedy had been shot. We all sat stunned as the owner turned up the volume on the radio. Life went on, and I continued to struggle with my place in the universe. Normally, I might have shelved such a topic as I pursued my courses, my political activities, and my social life. But with 2 classes a week in religions of the East, plus the required readings and papers, along with French literature of the 20th century, philosophical classics, and American literature, in which we were reading the Transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson, our place in the universe and the meaning of life, or the lack thereof, were continually in my consciousness. I anguished over these questions almost daily. One night in the fraternity house, I was talking on the phone with a junior from Goucher whom I was dating. To my regret, my relationship with Betty was more platonic than physical. She was very bright, an 18th century literature major, and we talked about everything. She was game enough to accompany me to a Gloria Lynn concert in the heart of Baltimore's inner city, where we were the only 2 white faces among 2,000 blacks attending the concert of the famous black singer, who also happened to be my father's partner's client. We chatted with Gloria Lynn after the show and were welcomed warmly by the other concert goers, who bought us drinks and engaged us easily in conversation. So Betty and I were good friends, as much as I was capable of being a real friend with someone I was also trying to have as much sex with as possible. She had heard me anguish before over the unanswerable questions of philosophy and religion, and the phone conversation of this evening was no different, except for the intensity of my concern. It seemed my spiritual struggle was reaching a climax, to the point where I was demanding of myself, the world, and Betty an answer finally to my question, what is the meaning of life? Betty answered me. She asked me, what is the meaning of meaning? And everything went haywire. My brain short-circuited, like a pinball machine on tilt. Lights flashed, whistles blew, And suddenly I was seeing and experiencing the most beautiful scene in my life. I was standing in front of a tableau that spanned the range of my vision. Although, as though standing on the shore facing the ocean, I saw that everything, ocean, sky, beach, and rocks, was all yellow, different shades of yellow, as if the sun were illuminating the whole scene, as if the sun were the whole scene. The tableau was not just off in the distance, it was reaching out to me, and I was connected to it. I was only a speck before this variegated yellow wall in front of and around me, but I was part of it all. The scene before me, the tableau, the sun, the many shades of yellow, pulsated, transfigured, and remained. It was all scenes in nature, beaches, trees, snow-capped mountains, lakes, and valleys. I saw and was part of them all. It was not just nature. It was also people and cities and skyscrapers and hustle and bustle that I saw and felt and was part of. It was everything, and it was all beautiful. There was no death, decay, sordidness. It was beyond human evaluation. I apprehended the energy of the universe. Whatever makes trees grow, or cars move, or skyscrapers stand, or nature beautiful, that is what I saw and felt and was a part of. I understood my place, all our place in the universe. Better than understanding it, I experienced it and was awed by how wonderful it was to be part of this whole. I was part of the total reality and consciously experienced myself as part of that reality. I felt ecstatic to be aware and alive, connection, my finiteness, and my boundless magnitude. To be human and aware was to be sublime. The meaning of life? My question was answered. Life does not mean. Life is. When I had tried to reduce the sublime universe to the confines of a narrow human construct like meaning, my answers were almost always unsatisfying. When the meaning of meaning expanded to become congruent with the universe, meaning became meaningless, and the deeper truth was revealed. When I comprehended simultaneously the infinite bounds of nature, its most finite particles, myself, and the energy permeating and connecting it all, I could only sit breathless with awe, humility, and ecstasy with tears in my eyes. I did not believe in God. I knew God. Betty's voice in the distance gradually grew louder. I realized I was in my room in the fraternity house, my feet on what Betty was saying. I tried to explain to her what had happened, but of course I couldn't come close. You had to be there. Like others through the centuries who purportedly came face to face with God, Moses in the burning bush, Job in the whirlwind, Buddha under the Bodhi tree, the many pilgrims who found salvation in Jesus's touch, or later, my friend Sally Sheldrake, a phone operator in Osable Forks, New York, who fell to her knees and was born again in the field outside her house. I translated my experience into terms I could understand in the context of my culture. As I knew nothing of Jewish mysticism or Christian redemption then, the Zen Buddhist concept of Satori, or enlightenment, seemed the best way to explain my experience. Like the Zen master's thwack on the head, which cut through the young monk's intellectualizing and produced Satori, Betty's question about the meaning of meaning had dislodged my conceptual apparatus and sent me on a consciousness express to parts unknown. Over the following days and weeks, I made sense of it and went on with my life. Everything had changed and nothing changed. My daily cares and priorities remained the same, working for political and social change, doing well in school, finding someone to love and really have intercourse with, having fun with friends, fulfilling my family obligations, figuring out my career, and learning all I could about myself, people, and the world around me. That was plenty to keep me busy and offer many further opportunities for intellectual confusion and emotional turmoil. But this much had changed. I never experienced existential anguish again, and I never again feared death. I knew my place in the scheme of things, and it was just fine. In rough times, it was always a vision to return to. Well, today I would describe myself as a Jew boo you you, Jewish Buddhist Unitarian. Judaism still culturally means an enormous amount to me. What the Jewish experience stands for and means in terms of social justice has great resonance to me, and my own personal connection with my parents and grandparents makes Jewishness something who I am. I always will be. I even joined a Jewish congregation in Tupper Lake, New York, of all places, an 1905 historic temple that's on the National Register of Historic Places. And once a year, this congregation of 15 people or so, 20 people come together to celebrate Rosh Hashanah, and I'm part of that. Buddhism is alive and well in my daily or not so daily meditation that still makes a big difference in my life and my sense of well-being. And Unitarian Universalism, as I mentioned, I started coming to the community at Winton Road about 2 or 2.5 years ago, in part because our children were attending, and it seemed like a good opportunity to share something with them and our grandchildren. And I've asked myself on and off in these last 2 years, shall I become an official member of the community? And if I don't think Shannon's on this call, but if any of you see her before I do, you could tell her that I'm ready to do it now, I'm ready to pull the plug and become officially a Unitarian, sign the membership book. And to me, it's not a contradiction. The three parts of my spiritual life seem of a whole, consisting, reinforcing one another. And so I feel privileged to be part of your, soon our, well, it's felt like our community since I started coming, because folks were so welcoming, and I got involved in RAIN and Soul Matters group and social justice activities of the church, and plan on continuing to do that. So I appreciate the invitation in the narrow sense with being an Elder Tree guest, but the invitation in the larger sense to become part of the community. And I would end by, if this technology works, showing you a picture of our family. And how do I do that? Host disable participant screen sharing. Is that be possible to undisable it? Do you see the picture now?
I just Howie, I just made you host, so you should be able to share your screen. Okay.
Okay. So I'm looking at the picture. I'm toggling back and forth. So I'll go back and hit share screen again.
Yeah.
And share screen. Where would?
If you're on a computer, it's usually on the
Normally
bottom.
I would see that. Oh, here we go. Share screen. And yep, here we go. You're about to see it. I think so. I have to hit share. Okay. You see it now? A picture now?
Yep, there
There
it
it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So my wife, Mary, who many of you know, also part of the UU community. And this was the family who was attending before we did. Our son Adam, we had, Mary and I had previous marriages. Our son Adam and his wife Renee, and our children Julia and Cameron. These pictures are 2 years old, so everybody's a little bigger now. And we were happy to have Julia came for a weekend to visit us in the Adirondacks this summer and stayed for 7 weeks. So that was a nice opportunity to get to know her better. And this picture was taken on the wedding day of daughter Elisa, Adam's brother Elisa, and husband Steve, and they live in Rochester as well. So we're lucky to have 2 of our 3 children near us. And my daughter, our daughter Kamara, lives in Minnesota as a pediatrician, and her husband Eric. And Kamara was adopted from Korea when she was 7 months old, and she has 3 sons now. We have 3 grandchildren in Minnesota: Kai and Hugo. And here's a picture of Luca now. So that's our family, some of whom you know. And again, I want to thank everybody for the opportunity. Let me just toggle back to, well, I'll get off this somehow. Stop share. Here we go. Again, thanks everybody for being so patient with me today, and look forward to seeing you on other occasions. Thank you.